Welcome in. I'm Austin Westfall. You've heard that Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar, a mastermind of the October 7th attack that triggered the Gaza war, was killed by the IDF. His death does mark a huge success for Israel and is perhaps the most pivotal event since the year-long conflict began. You've been told that his death is important, but what I want to examine now is why it's important. Who was Sinwar? How did he come to power? How was he able to become the bin Laden-esque figure that he became? And what does history teach us about where we go from here? Alon Burstein, he's with me now for an extended talk. Alon, as always, good to see you. Sinwar was born in the 60s in what was then Egyptian-controlled Gaza. He was known as the Butcher of Khan Yunis. What do we need to know about his origin? Let's tell the story of his younger years and what led him to getting that nickname in the late 1980s.
It's good to see you, Austin. Yes, a very, very big turning point in the Israel-Hamas war. To be perfectly honest, we don't know where it's turning yet. We don't know if this is going to, in which direction and trajectory this is going to spiral us with regards to the war, but we know that things are going to be different. So, the importance of Yahya Sinwar, like you said, he was born in 1962 in Han Yunis, in the refugee camps, actually, of Han Yunis in the Gaza Strip. A couple of important facets of his origins are that his family had been from the area that would become Israel, was Palestine, and then became Israel, and they fled after 1948-49 from the area that would become the Israeli town of Ashkelon. That facet was very meaningful for him in his upbringing. He grew up on these stories. And it's important also to note that he was born before the Six-Day War, when it seemed apparent that the Arab armies were going to come back and defeat Israel, and all the Palestinian refugees were going to go back. So he grew up on these stories of the fact that Palestinians are going to reclaim their homeland, and that was very significant to him. When he was already in his late teens, there started to be the development of the Hamas movement. The Hamas movement grew out of the Muslim Brotherhood in the Gaza Strip, and he joined the ranks in one of the founding meetings. He was not one of the founding circle of Hamas in 1987. He was, to be quite direct, too young to be one of the founders. However, he was one of the most leading operatives in the field. But his role was unique. He was not just one of the operatives that was going to be in charge of gun running or going to be in charge of trying to smuggle weapons or funding organizations. He was put in charge of what was called the Majid, which was the internal security mechanism of Hamas. That meant that his focus was actually on Palestinians rather than on the engagement with Israel. The Majid's tasks were divided in two. One was to secure the quote-unquote moral standard of Palestinians as far as Hamas, the Muslim Brotherhood, was concerned. That meant attacking people who drank alcohol, burning down pornography stores, and the second, most importantly, it was targeting Palestinians who were suspected to be collaborators with the Israeli occupation. And Yahya Sinwar took this job very, very seriously. Between the time of Hamas's foundation at the end of 1987 until his arrest in 1989, he personally oversaw, and in some cases was the person who executed over 10 Palestinians. In some cases, I'm not going to get into it, very brutal descriptions of those executions. And that is what earned him the nickname, the Butcher of Han Yunis. He was known as someone who, among the Palestinians, was someone to be feared, someone who within this new organization called Hamas was becoming the terrorizing figure of Palestinians. Anyone who was suspected of violating moral codes and or collaborating with Israel, he was one to be feared. And that is actually what he was arrested for by the IDF in 1989. It was for attacking Palestinians and executing them, not actually attacks against Israelis or the IDF.
So let's talk about his time in Israeli prison. He was locked up for roughly 2 decades, and ironically, an Israeli doctor saved his life at one point. He also learned Hebrew during that time, didn't he? What do we need to know about his time behind bars?
So yes, he was sentenced to 5 life sentences for those different murders that either he committed himself or was in charge of. And during his time in prison, he did in fact get a disease, and it required very substantial surgery, and reportedly that did save his life. But the more important facet of his time in Israeli prisons was what some of his interrogators and actually his cellmates also have termed his quote unquote developed obsession with understanding Israel, Israelis, and Israeli culture. He learned fluent Hebrew, and according to, again, different testimony of people who served with him in prison, he never missed the evening news in Israel and would sit there taking notes to try to understand what Israelis are understanding. How does their society and culture work? Another facet, again, when you think of someone who, could have been described as a street thug who was going around attacking Palestinians, not only did he learn Hebrew, during his time in prison, he actually meticulously translated the books, autobiographies of different heads of Shabak, that's the Israeli internal intelligence, and different IDF retired generals, their autobiographies. He translated from Hebrew to Arabic because he said Palestinians need to understand. Palestinians need to devote themselves to understanding Israeli psyche and Israeli mentality. Those facets of understanding Israel, understanding Israelism, proved to be very, very important. His whole orchestration of the October 7th attack, the way he meticulously worked for over 2 years to completely fool the Israeli government into thinking that he is going to one direction while planning the October 7th attack on the other. The fact that he was ended up being killed while still evading Israeli intelligence. He was killed completely by coincidence, according to the IDF, shows sort of the rewards of that meticulous study. He studied Israeli intelligence, he studied Israeli culture and psyche. He knew exactly which buttons to push in order to terrorize Israelis psychologically, and he also knew how to overcome IDF and Israeli intelligence much more, I would argue, than any other Hamas leader in history. And a lot of this can be attributed to that obsession that he developed with Israeli politics and understanding Israeli psyche.
Why was he released from prison?
So he was sentenced to five life sentences. However, in 2006, an Israeli IDF soldier, Gilad Shalit, was kidnapped from the border of the Gaza Strip and brought back into the Gaza Strip. Anecdotally, I'll say the mastermind of that kidnapping was actually Yahya Sinwar's younger brother, Muhammad Sinwar, who had become one of the leaders of the Al-Qassam brigades in the Gaza Strip. Gilad Shalit was kidnapped and he was held in the Gaza Strip for 5 years. He was held in the Gaza Strip from 2006 until 2011. According to reports, he was held by both Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and the Popular Front of the Liberation of Palestine. Eventually, it was negotiated in the hostage deal of 2011 that Gilad Shalit would be released in exchange for 1,027 Palestinian prisoners. Yahya Sinwar was among those prisoners. And another important note that I'll say about that, Yahya Sinwar, despite the fact that he was number one on the list to be released, because it was his brother who was in charge of holding Gilad Shalit, and he made sure Yahya Sinwar was number one to be released, Yahya Sinwar publicly called on Hamas to not carry out the deal. He said, do not secure my release. Hold Gilad Shalit until you can release all Palestinian prisoners. I don't want a partial deal. Hamas did not heed that call, and he was released nonetheless. But that facet, the fact that he was released while he was saying, no, don't release me, make sure you release everyone, stayed burnt in his psyche. You can see in a lot of his speeches, a lot of his rhetoric, he saw himself personally obligated, almost like you could say survivor's guilt, personally obligated to securing the release of the rest of the Palestinian prisoners who, as far as he's concerned, were his brethren who he left behind when he was released in 2011.
Is that part of what makes people nervous when we talk about the exchange of Israeli hostages for Palestinian prisoners? Because Sinwar himself was once one of those prisoners?
Very much. It's one of he is the most sort of archetypical example, but a lot of Palestinian prisoners who are released from Israeli jails end up coming back and being involved in terrorist activities. This is not unique to the Israeli-Palestinian situation. We've seen this with the deal that was made in 2020 between the US administration under Trump and the Taliban regime, securing the release of 5,000 Taliban fighters, also with the Taliban pledging that they're no longer going to allow any attacks against US interests. The Taliban, within several months after that, sweep through Afghanistan, take over. Large amounts of them were those prisoners who were released, and Al Qaeda went back to operating from within Afghanistan. It's unfortunately very common that within the world of releasing hostages for terrorists that are held in different jails, what ends up happening, despite all kinds of claims of the organization, those people who are released end up coming back in heroic figures, being elevated because of their heroism, and end up taking up roles that continue the fight. So this is part of the ongoing debate within Israel. So what do? Do you release more Palestinian prisoners that may result in the more deaths of Israelis, or do you accept the death of Israelis, the hostages, and sort of make sure, quote unquote, that no more Palestinian prisoners are released? That's often the debate, and Sinwar is the biggest example of that dilemma.
So how does he transition from prisoner to being one of the top guys in Hamas?
So it's attributable to a lot of different factors that came together. First of all, a Palestinian prisoner who is released, especially in a hostage deal, has a lot of clout within Palestinian society. Palestinian prisoners are one of the biggest issues within Palestinian culture. Every culture has its own issues that are like very, very sensitive. And for in the Palestinian society, Palestinian prisoners are one of the biggest facets. So the fact that you're a prisoner who also rose within the prison ranks to become one of the prominent figures. We sometimes talk, you and me, about heavy Palestinian prisoners, Marwan Barghouti, Yahya Sinwar, one of the heavier Palestinian prisoners. The fact that he is released, that unto itself puts him in an elevated status. Then there was the fact that his brother, Muhammad Sinwar, was the orchestrator of this big release. He is the one who managed to bring together, again, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hamas, some ranks from even the Popular Front of the Liberation of Palestine, and the Popular Resistance Brigades all came together, carried out that kidnapping in 2006. So this was his brother who then secured the release of another 1,026 Palestinian prisoners, in addition to Yahya Sinwar. That also put him in a very, very top-ranking position. A third thing that came together is one of the things I said originally is that Sinwar was not part of the original founding circle of Hamas, among others, because he was, quote unquote, too young at that time. By the time he's released, most of the founding circle of Hamas is no longer leading Hamas. A lot of them have been assassinated. The founder and leader of Hamas, Ahmed Yassin, his deputy Abdulaziz Rantisi, both assassinated in 2004. Other leaders like Khalid Masha and Musa Abu Marzouk had since left and were living in exile of the Gaza Strip. So the people who were in charge of the Gaza Strip were already that younger generation, by then not as young, that younger generation. So Sinwar really fit in with them as part of by then it was becoming the old guard. And he rose the ranks. One of the things that really made him prominent is that knowledge of Israeli society and a lot of the connections that he had formed within Israeli prisons with other Palestinians to allow him to begin networking. It was after his release that he started to develop this vision of creating a resistance front that would bring the region together, to stop having just Hamas fighting Israel, and then just Hezbollah fighting Israel, and then maybe Iran threatening Israel, and then maybe militias in Syria also at some point attacking Israel, to try to coordinate things together. He rose because of the fact that he had learned how to also sort of manipulate and play Israeli psyche, and at the same time had developed a lot of these connections, allowing him in 2017 to be elected to be the leader of Hamas in the Gaza Strip.
So was he known among the greater Israeli public before the October 7th attack?
Yes, ever since 2017, when he was elected the leader of Hamas, he became a much more public figure. And I say the leader of Hamas, but he's the leader of Hamas in the Gaza Strip. One of the things that Hamas did after the assassinations of 2004 of the leadership, Ahmed Yassin and Abdulaziz Rantisi, Hamas made a strategic decision to split its leadership in two. It said the political leadership, the one that is going to be the face to the world and the political diplomatic side, needs to be outside of the occupied Palestinian territories. It needs to be somewhere where they can be quote unquote safe. Obviously, this doesn't work for Ismail Haniyeh, but it needs to be somewhere where they are safe. And the ones who are more the fighters need to stay within the Gaza Strip. So that was the situation since 2004 and more adamantly since 2007. So in 2017, Yahya Sinwar becomes the leader of Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Ismail Haniyeh, that is the moment that he was elected to be the leader of the political bureau of Hamas, and he leaves the Gaza Strip because of that, and he goes to Qatar. That's when that changing of the guard happened. From that moment, Yahya Sinwar became a very, very prominent figure. He started making public speeches. He sort of came out of the shadows of someone who was advocating what's going to be with Hamas in the background, and instead started to be this image, like we see in these pictures here, people of someone who was leading mass rallies and leading the escalatory confrontations with Israel ever since he came to power in 2018, 19, massive escalation in 2021, 2022. All of these things, Hamas at times played a critical role. At times, it actually took more of a backseat because it wanted to pretend that it was going towards more of a some sort of accommodation. But in all these things, Sinwar was a very, very public figure. What was the mistake that that large elements of Israeli society and more importantly, the Israeli government saw was that they took Sinwar's rhetoric to be purely rhetoric. They took Sinwar's rhetoric to be something like he is talking about the big upcoming storm that's going to destroy the Zionist entity. He is talking about our armies that are going to flood through Palestine, the end of the Zionist regime. It was all seen as rhetoric, and Sinwar was very intelligent to make sure that Israelis thought it was rhetoric. One of the things that he did very, very meticulously, starting in 2021, he made sure to send messages to Israel through diplomatic channels and through a lot of inaction, not actually participating in escalations, to try to say, I am happy to be a political leader. I am happy to just be the governor, so to speak, of Gaza. I am happy to have the economic situation develop. I'm not looking for an escalation. He did that very intelligently, playing on Israeli mentality and the Israeli governments, while at the same time clearly planning and masterminding this overarching attack that no one in Israel expected.
We in the media primarily refer to him, of course, as the mastermind of the October 7th attack. I want to chronicle what's known about the planning of that attack and the construction of the labyrinth of tunnels underneath Gaza. What do we know about that time, Alon?
So the construction of tunnels in the Gaza Strip actually started way back when. Some reports are already in 2012. There started to be some say in 2009. In 2012, they started to be more and more significant. And at that time, the attempt of Hamas was to build attack tunnels that would go from the Gaza Strip underneath the Israeli towns and kibbutzim that surround the Gaza Strip, the Gaza envelope, to allow Hamas fighters to essentially burst through tunnels in that area. The tunnels were mostly uncovered by Israel and the IDF in 2014, and Israel, the IDF, and primarily the Shabak invested monumental amounts of money and intelligence to build an underground, both concrete blockade as well as intelligence network, electronics, etc., to essentially stop all tunnels from crossing over from Gaza into Israel. I'll say an anecdote that was mostly successful. The October 7th attack happened all above ground because of those tunnels. Meanwhile, however, what Hamas did bother to do is invest all of its time and money since essentially 2014, 2015, 2016 in building tunnels within the Gaza Strip. That's been happening since then. We're talking about a decade now that Hamas has been investing itself in building these attack tunnels, strategic tunnels, all leading up to this event of October 7th. But also throughout the years, these tunnels have been used in different attacks that Hamas has carried out. In terms of planning October 7th, there's different reports that allude to when the planning began. What I will say that we know is starting in 2017, Yahya Sinwar was faced with a choice. He was now made the new leader of Hamas in the Gaza Strip, And there were attempts then within the Israeli government to come to some sort of long-term deal with Hamas, some sort of mutual understanding. The two sides don't recognize each other, but coming to an agreed upon period of calm, an agreed upon period of ceasefire. Israel would allow more Palestinian workers to come in from the Gaza Strip. In turn, Hamas would not allow the development of weapons and things like that. And Sinwar seemingly toyed with this idea for a while. Between 2017 and 2018, Sinwar tried to toy with this idea, and there were roundabout diplomatic negotiations, primarily through Egypt. At that time, there's no indication that Sinwar was actually planning a large-scale attack. Those those negotiations did not really go far. The Israeli government primarily did not see Sinwar as someone who's to be trusted, and did not go far. And in 2018-19, they were largely dropped. According to most reports, planning something like the October 7th attack started sometime between 2020 and 2021. Hamas had been developing the weaponry that it needed for a long time. It had been training in front of Israeli intelligence all the time. There were constant training missions, and these were being shown live in Israeli media and in Palestinian media, being shown live of the Nukhba fighters planning to take over Israeli kibbutzim, how they're going to carry out raids in towns. Pretty much like Yahya Sinwar's rhetoric, this was all seen as it's just for show. It's just Hamas constantly saying, yes, they're going to do this one day, much like lots of different, quote unquote, crackpot organizations say we're going to take over the world one day. That is how these were viewed. Hamas was taking them seriously. One of the things is an anecdote, one of the famous incidents of the October 7th attack was the hang gliders that were coming in, that landed in different Israeli towns and in the Israeli music festival and things like that. Even that, Hamas needed to train. How was it going to train in front of Israel? In order to allow Hamas to actually train its fighters with this, they orchestrated an entire scheme. They started a youth club that was going to be a youth club of hang gliders and paragliding and things like that. And they actually registered this youth club with international organizations of paragliding and things like that, and informed UNRWA and Israeli intelligence, we are carrying out this as part of that youth club movement, all in order to, under the guise of these teens that were actually just having fun, to train the hang glider attacks that were going to happen on October 7th. The entire attack was planned likely for well over 2 years. It was unclear exactly when it was going to be executed. According to some reports, Hamas actually had planned to execute it in 2023, much earlier. Back in April, it was supposed to be executed on the eve of Passover. They then suspected that the IDF had thickened some of its activity around the Gaza Strip, so they chose to delay it. Yahya Sinwar actually wanted the attack to be executed on Yom Kippur on last year in 2023. However, in an internal debate, we don't know why, it was decided to delay it by a week and a half, and thus it was executed the last day of the Jewish high holidays. But the attack was meticulously planned, and it was all planned from within the Gaza Strip. Elements around Hezbollah, the Hamas leadership, they were informed of the attack about a half an hour before it was launched. They were told something big is going to happen. So over the years, they were told, FYI, we're planning something big. But according to most intelligence, that's all they knew.
That brings us to October 7th, and that brings us to the past year. This has been something that you and I have been talking about almost on the daily. He's been elusive, Sinwar, throughout this entire thing alone. What has the IDF been saying about their efforts to nail him down in the past 12 months? Everything up to the point before he was actually killed.
Sinwar has been the number one target for the IDF, for the Israeli Shabak, on many, many levels. He's been the number one target, first and foremost, symbolically. He is like you said at the beginning, the Osama bin Laden of Israel. Right? Osama bin Laden, after 9/11, didn't have another 9/11 up his sleeve, but he was symbolic of the person who managed to devastate and carry out such a devastating attack and humiliate and all these things to the United States. Same thing with Sinwar. So on symbolic levels, if he would have survived the war, that would have been a major boost for Hamas for all of the devastation and tens of thousands of Palestinians killed and hundreds of Israeli soldiers killed. You didn't manage to kill your number one enemy. And it would have been sort of a victory for Hamas and a moral defeat for Israel. So that's one of the reasons that monumental resources had been invested into trying to find him. The IDF said on several occasions that they were almost on his tail. They said in some cases that they managed to get to a tunnel and there was evidence, possibly DNA or something else, stating that Yahya Sinwar had been there a short while ago. They were constantly trying to find him and be on his tracks, and he knew this. He knew this. According to some reports, he had surrounded himself for a long time with different hostages in order to, for fear of any targeted assassinations that may be hitting him. There were a lot of reports that he was hiding in tunnels. You asked me, I think about a month ago, do we know where Yahya Sinwar is? And I said, in my opinion, we're probably going to find him in a building in Han Yunis. I thought it would be Han Yunis, not Rafah, because everyone was looking in the tunnels. Unclear what he was doing exactly today or yesterday when he was killed, if this happened because he was fleeing from place to place, or if this is actually where he'd been the entire time. There are different reports emanating, but none of them, as far as I can tell, are substantiated. One of the things that was published today, though, is that, and the IDF said they did not publish this earlier because they didn't want to expose intelligence, is that in that incident where 6 hostages had been executed in a tunnel, apparently Yahya Sinwar's DNA was found in traces in that tunnel as well, or in a tunnel that was right adjacent to it. So either those hostages were held with Sinwar, maybe they were his human shield, and then when the IDF suspected was coming close, Al-Qassam executed them and Sinwar and others fled, and maybe that's why he didn't have any hostages near him right now. Or he was held up in a tunnel next to them, but that is one of the last things that we know about his whereabouts. I will say also that the fact that he ended up being found in Tel Sultan in Rafah, Tel Sultan has proven to be the crux of Hamas fighting. It has been the most intensive fighting, more than Gaza City, more than Zaytun, Rimal, Sajaiya, more than different areas in Han Yunis. Tel Sultan, one of the most southern neighborhoods in the Gaza Strip. The IDF had been fighting there for months on end. And again, you and I had spoken time and again, what's happening? I was like, there's still fighting going on in Tel Sultan. It is one of the most hardline places that the IDF was trying to take over. And we saw it today. This was a routine operation that the IDF was carrying out. They're still going building by building within Tel Sultan. So the fact that Sinwar seemingly was held up there, so Hamas's main headquarters was there, is not surprising in light of the intensive fighting that has been going on.
So yeah, that brings us to now, and we've been looking at this footage on screen, and this is bizarre stuff, to say the least, these images that we're looking at alone. This was an accident, by all means. We heard from the IDF's Doron Spielman on Live Now earlier today saying such. What do you make of where they eventually found him? What do you make of this footage that we're looking at right now? This is an Israeli drone that captured what they say are some of his last moments alive. What did you make of all this coming out today and how it played out?
So reportedly what happened is an IDF unit had come across 3 armed militant Palestinians, and then in their attempts to gun them down, a gun battle ensued and they split up into 2 units. Sinwar went one way and the other 2 went another way. Then, as the IDF was going to come into the building, they discovered that the building was actually rigged with explosives. And thus they sent in these drones. Again, at this point, they don't know this is Yahya Sinwar. The fact that, on the image here, it says Yahya Sinwar, this is after the fact. As far as they were concerned, this was just your quote unquote average Palestinian militant. At this point, where Sinwar is sitting there, he has already been shot. According to reports, he was in the gun battles shot in the arm. That is likely one of the reasons that we see him sitting. And when he sees an IDF drone, he essentially doesn't do anything except for throwing a metal bar, trying to hit that drone. He's not trying to flee, he's not trying to escape. He's already been shot. He's already injured. He's likely trying to catch his breath here. As a result of the fact that this drone managed to identify that the building was rigged, the IDF carried out what they call a detonating operation that is firing several tank shells into the building, essentially making it collapse. And that is actually what killed him. So he was both shot and injured and was killed as a result of the tank shells that were fired into this building. Again, there's been a lot of speculation on over what he was doing here. We saw the other key figures. Muhammad Def was also assassinated when he had come up from where reportedly he was in tunnels surrounded by hostages. He was assassinated in the humanitarian zone in El Mawasi. What was he doing there? Why did he come above ground? Then it seemed that Muhammad Def was holding a military meeting. Here, Yahya Sinwar, we see his face is covered. He was armed with bulletproof vests and with guns. Maybe he was fleeing from a place to place. Maybe the IDF was operating close to where he was. He was trying to flee. It is also possible, I would speculate, that he had actually been held up in these buildings the entire time. And when the IDF came close, that is when he decided to flee. Again, the importance of the fact that he was in Rafah and Tel Sultan tells us something about why and how Hamas had built up that area to be the biggest stronghold that they have, rather than what was anticipated. Sajaiya in the north, Han Yunis in the south. Actually, Tel Sultan ended up being the biggest stronghold. It's also noteworthy that this is close to the Egyptian border, so it's possible that was another reason they wanted this to be their stronghold as part of gun running or weapon smuggling or things like that. But at this point, I will say we don't actually know what he was doing above ground. Was he going somewhere? Was he going somewhere else? Was he fleeing, or was this where he had been held up the entire time? We don't actually know at this point.
Back in 2011, President Obama decided against releasing photos of Osama bin Laden's body because their graphic nature, they worried, would incite further violence. There are graphic photos of Sinwar's corpse out there. I cannot show them on the broadcast. Alon, are you surprised that those photos are out there? What do you make of that?
First of all, thank you for not showing them. I was looking at them throughout the day as well. There's a couple of things to make of that. One is that unlike the decision that was made by President Obama back after the death of bin Laden, this is in an ongoing war. So that is different. That, you could say was maybe an ongoing war against Al-Qaeda, but essentially that was a military raid that was carried out actually in Pakistan, not even in Afghanistan. It was a lot more controlled. It was planned, it was designed, and there was also time to think. In this case, what happened is, in the midst of war, 3 militants were killed. A drone later, the next day, this actually all happened on October 16th. The next day, a drone came in and photographs. They said, "Wait a minute, is that who we think it is?" And only then did they try to excavate the body, which was very difficult because the building was in fact booby-trapped with a lot of explosives. Then IDF soldiers came in. Then the body was taken back for identification. All this is a lot less controllable. It's not a mission that you thought out what is going to be the outcome, how it's going to be. So I'm not surprised that there was not a lot of thought put in to controlling the spreading of images at that point. Another facet is the images were very likely disseminated by IDF soldiers on the ground. They were not disseminated by official channels. That also matters. The elite unit that carried out the raid on bin Laden's compound was made up of specially trained, highly professionalized soldiers, whereas here, the IDF has very trained and specialized soldiers, but this was not the most commando elite unit. This was actually a unit of trainee officers that is operating within the Gaza Strip. It's just a lot harder to control. I don't think that there was any decision to actually disseminate those pictures. I think it was much more done spur of the moment by some soldiers. That said, I'm not sure that if decisions were taken, that it wouldn't have been decided in the interest of sort of crushing Hamas morale and lifting Israeli morale, that the images wouldn't have been disseminated. While the comparison that you drew to the decision of Obama and bin Laden is true, we also remember images of Saddam Hussein, who, for no apparent reason, not only was he shown after he was arrested, he was shown having his teeth examined for no reason, right? You could have equally shown him having a mugshot behind bars, showing him having his teeth, his mouth pried open and his teeth being examined was a way to say, you, our arch enemy, we're going to publicly display you now. So different countries have decided different things on what to do with images of, their sort of arch nemesis. I'm not going to say what's right or wrong. I'm going to say I'm not sure a decision was actually made here to lead to this, but if a decision was made, I'm not sure it would have been different.
Let's talk about the future. What is left of Hamas post Sinwar, and who could succeed him, if possible?
So a lot of people have been asking, so is the war over? Everyone's talking about, Israel has said, total victory, complete victory. And often we've said, what does it exactly mean? So possibly, is this over? So first of all, sorry to disillusion people, the war is not over for many reasons. But chief among them is Hamas's military ranks are still there. The military ranks, the Al-Qassam brigades, according to reports, had some 30,000 troops prior to the war. Israel's estimated between 14,000 and 17,000 have been killed. That leaves at least 13,000, if not more, that were trained prior to the war, let alone those that have been now recruited and trained as a result of the war, and hundreds of thousands of guns. The war is still ongoing in the Gaza Strip. What may happen, though, is we may see the Gaza Strip fracture and the military ranks sort of go into several different units, a little bit like we saw in Afghanistan at several different times when sort of warlords started to come up. You have a very dense population, hundreds of thousands of weapons, lots of different military factions. It's possible to see a splintering of the Hamas organization into several different splinters. That's in terms of on the ground. We don't know exactly if that's going to happen or not, but the large elements of Hamas's leadership in the Gaza Strip are in fact killed. At the same time, Hamas's leadership has been killed before. The founder and leader of Hamas, the person who was the unquestionable leader of the group, Ahmed Yassin, was assassinated in 2004. His successor, Abdulaziz Rantisi, was assassinated a month later in 2004. Hamas came back to win the elections in 2006, and we've seen what happened since then. So Hamas as a movement is unlikely to be defeated as a result of decapitating its leader. What we are going to see, though, is a critical change. And we're going to see a critical change likely dependent on who is going to be the next leader. There are several names that are being floated. The most likely successors are in the Gaza Strip. Muhammad Sinwar. Muhammad Sinwar, I mentioned him before, is Yahya Sinwar's brother, his younger brother. He is someone who also grew up in the ranks of Hamas. He was a division commander of the Al-Qassam brigades, Han Yunis battalions, already in 2005. And especially since October 7th, he really, really rose within the Hamas leadership. After the assassination of Mohammed Def, he became the leader of the Al-Qassam brigades. He is currently the strongest man in the Gaza Strip. So he is very likely to be one of the candidates for the next leader. Then we have the external leadership. The external leadership, Khalid Mashal, chief among them, but there's also Musa Abu Marzouk, also Khalil al-Haya. All of these reside in Qatar. Prior to the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, they were in a much stronger position. The external leadership was the one that was officially in charge, and then there was the internal leadership in the Gaza Strip. After Ismail Haniyeh was assassinated, Yahya Sinwar was made the leader of the entire Hamas movement, but now we may go back to that split. We may go back to seeing that situation where we have an external leadership like Khalid Mashal. In fact, one of the Lebanese news sites today already quoted that Khalid Mashal is going to be the next leader, although I say that cautiously because it wasn't picked up anywhere else, but it was suggested in one of the Lebanese news sites. So it could be Khalid Mashal, could be Musa Abu Marzouk, or it could be Muhammad Sinwar. The identity, that's why I said at the beginning, it's going to be a critical juncture, but we don't know yet in which direction. Muhammad Sinwar, Yahya Sinwar's brother, is known to be just as ruthless as his brother. He is the one who orchestrated the kidnapping of Gilad Shalit in 2006. He was one of the masterminds of the October 7th attack and one of the people who was in charge of the hostages. So if he becomes leader, we don't really know a lot about his diplomatic status. We don't know if he'll be more inclined to a hostage deal and a truce and try to look to the future to rebuild or want to continue the war. We don't know that much about him politically. We know He has a lot of prowess and a lot of feathers in his cap when it comes to fighting Israel and the Al-Qassam brigades, but we don't actually know what that means in terms of where the war is going to go. In turn, if Khalid Mashal becomes the leader of Hamas, we know Khalid Mashal a little bit more. He was the leader of Hamas already from 2007, 2017. He is known to be, on the one hand, very, very ideologically committed. On the other hand, also relatively practical when it comes to deciding the trajectory of Hamas. He was one of the people who sort of advocated that Hamas should break its taboo and run in the elections in 2006. And one of the things that's also very important about Khalid Mashal, he has very good relationships with Qatar. Does not have that good relationships with Iran, unlike a lot of the other Hamas leadership, as a result of the Syrian civil war and him advocating that Hamas should side with the rebels instead of with the Syrian government. Iran, they've forgiven each other, sort of, but it's not a close marriage like it was with Ismail Haniyeh. So no matter what happens and who takes over, we're going to see a different trajectory in the war, but what type of different trajectory and where it's taking us, we still have to wait to see who the next leader is.
Before, it was kind of an external leadership, there was an internal leadership. Does it feel like the future of the leadership needs to be within Gaza?
So that's a big question that Hamas is right now facing because they decided to have an external leadership and make that be the overarching leader as a result of the dangers of assassination, as a result of they decided this during the Second Palestinian Intifada from 2000 to 2004. So they decided this because of the dangers of assassination. First of all, those dangers now seem to have gone far beyond the Gaza Strip. Ismail Haniyeh was assassinated in the capital of Iran.
Right.
So that reasoning doesn't really hold up on the one hand. On the other hand, in the Gaza Strip right now, it is a lot harder to take up a diplomatic position and a leadership role and not actually be the next target of assassination. So Hamas is going to have to decide, okay, does it not matter anymore, and we may as well have the leadership in Gaza, or does this still matter because we'd like the leadership to survive more than another couple of months? Let's have an external leader. One of the things that Hamas is going to have to contend with, though, is that when the war broke out, we had Ismail Haniyeh, one of the longest and most important figures within Hamas, and Yahya Sinwar in the Gaza Strip. Ismail Haniyeh was officially negotiating in Qatar, but he had actually no say. Yahya Sinwar wasn't necessarily going to listen to him if Haniyeh came to a deal that ended the war or that secured the release of a certain amount of hostages. So Haniyeh would negotiate and then essentially go and ask Sinwar, so do you agree or disagree? So even though Haniyeh was officially in charge, Sinwar was one calling the shots. Now, again, we do not know because both Haniyeh and Sinwar have been killed. So we don't know if Khalid Mashal takes control. He negotiates now something with Qatar through negotiators to Israel. Who does he even talk to in the Gaza Strip to implement this? Khalid Mashal has no clue where the hostages are. He has no clue who's holding the hostages. Mohammed Sinwar in the Gaza Strip does. So is he going to talk to Mohammed Sinwar? Well, Mohammed Sinwar then may say, you know what, I'm in charge. So it depends. They could decide to cooperate. This worked for Hamas from essentially 2007 until 2023. This worked. They had an external leadership, an internal leadership. The internal leadership accepted the overarching control of the external leadership, and they worked together. Then this broke down to some extent in the war. If they succeed in working together now, it may be in their benefit to have an external leader that's more protected and an internal leader. However, again, we know very little actually about Mohammed Sinwar and his character in terms of leadership. Will he recognize, hey, it's in my interest to do that? Or will he say, you know what? I'm anyway going to be hunted by the IDF. I want to be declared the leader of Hamas. Maybe we'll see a fracture in the movement. We really don't know.
I got to ask you a tough question. How do Gaza civilians view Sinwar? That's a tough thing to measure, isn't it, Alon?
It's downright impossible to measure. What we're looking at now are images of the Al Mawasi refugee camp. This is a refugee camp, I'll just say, in southern Gaza, which, prior to the war was a very impoverished area that housed between 10,000 and 20,000 people. This was declared the humanitarian zone in the Gaza Strip Right now, it's housing roughly 1.6 million people within these different refugee camps. That's one of the reasons we're seeing this densely populated area. How do the residents view Sinwar? It's very hard to know. On the one hand, when the war broke out, we saw a lot of people actually carrying out what had never been seen before, social mobilization and protests against Hamas. There were protests almost every night in Jabalia refugee camp, in Zaytun, and in the areas of Han Yunis, with people going out and chanting against Israel and against the IDF for what it's doing, and against Sinwar for bringing the war and devastation onto Gaza. That was very quickly suppressed by Hamas. Hamas runs quite a dictatorial government. So we don't actually know. Is there a movement there that's waiting to erupt and to say we're tired? Hamas has been the leader of the Gaza Strip since 2007, since it took over, and all we've gotten is repeated devastation from the IDF. Or at the same time, there's many people who, say, yes, but the IDF is the big enemy, regardless of what Hamas may have done, it doesn't justify coming in and bombing this entire area. So both opinions could logically be heard within the Gaza Strip. The polls that were published right after the October 7th attack showed overwhelming support of the Palestinian population for the October 7th attack. Then, several months ago, it was published by the IDF. They actually found computers where Hamas had completely altered and skewed the results of those surveys and showed that there's actually less than 40%, and in some cases 30% of Palestinian population that's in support of the way Hamas had carried out the October 7th attack and the war. At the same time, that doesn't mean that people are going to look at the complete devastation of the Gaza Strip and say, well, actually, it's Hamas's fault, not the IDF. You have to remember, we now have generations of Palestinians that have grown up either under Israeli occupation or within the Israeli siege, generations of children that have been educated in Hamas education systems alongside UNRWA education systems. It's very hard to gauge what the average Palestinian in the Gaza Strip thinks. Moreover, it's hard to gauge what they're exposed to and the levels in which they actually can get accurate news about what happened on October 7th, what Israel is doing or trying to do, who is Israel even, and what Hamas is responsible for or not responsible for. Anecdotally, I'll say there were surveys that were done, and I actually know some people who spoke to people in the Gaza Strip right after the October 7th attack, and all Gazans knew was the massive bombings that were happening. They had not even heard of the October 7th attack yet. So, obviously since then they have heard about that. But again, when you don't have telecommunication services that are working, when electricity has been cut off for the Gaza Strip already now for over a year, when you have education systems and communications networks that are completely controlled by Hamas, very hard to know what your average Palestinian in the Gaza Strip is exposed to and what they think.
What lessons can Israel and the world learn about preventing figures like Sinwar from materializing in the future?
So, one of the popular counterterrorism strategies is attempted decapitation, is trying to eliminate the head of an organization. And usually this does have an immediate effect. It sends the organization into a sort of shock, especially religious organizations. Long lasting, however, it doesn't seem to work. And we've seen this with Al Qaeda, that is still up and running and getting strong in different places in Afghanistan and Southeast Asia. We've also seen this in cases like ISIS that still controls some territory, Boko Haram, Al Shabaab, many cases we see, and Hamas, also an example with the assassinations of Ahmed Yassin. We've seen that decapitation does send an organization into shock and makes them regroup. And like I said, critical juncture can maybe go a different way, but it does not make organizations disappear. Organizations tend to disappear, again, comparatively, when it comes to looking at international politics. Terror groups have only really dwindled and disappeared when there's been a combination of repression as well as some sort of political diplomatic resolution. That's the only way that different organizations, ranging from the IRA to different organizations in Egypt, to organizations that we've seen in Kashmir, in a lot of circumstances, when we've seen organizations that end up the FARC in Colombia, when we've seen organizations that have ended up demilitarizing and coming to some sort of agreement. And basically, when we've seen war zones stopping to be war zones, it is when an organization is both suffering repression, but at the same time has a diplomatic avenue. And then the population sometimes starts to lose support for the organization. So repression is important. Some people say, okay, so you have to go for complete accommodation, or some people say you have to go for only repression. I am saying comparatively, you have to have some sort of combination of both. Otherwise, you will send the organization into some sort of shock. But you ask, what can we learn about not repeating? There is going to be another Sinwar, whether it's Muhammad Sinwar or whether it's someone else, just like there was another Ahmed Yassin, someone else who took the ranks, just like the leader of ISIS was replaceable, leader of Al Qaeda was replaceable. These leaders are replaceable. So only some sort of combination of repression and diplomatic channels can actually have long-term effects. It remains to be seen, though, how that can happen and who you're negotiating with. Again, depends who the next leader is. We're all waiting.
Alon, as always, we appreciate your time, and we always look forward to your uploads on your YouTube channel as well. You always post great updates, pretty much highlighting every few days, and we appreciate your work. We appreciate you joining us for this extended conversation. Big news piece. Take care. Have a good night.
Thank you for having me. Always good to see you, Austin. Have a good night.